Hello everyone and welcome to this Frontline workshop. Today we're going to give you a little bit of a taster from Raising Resilience. Now you might have heard of Developing Dolphins and Raising Resilience. Both of those are 5-week courses that are delivered by eating disorder clinicians, and it's a chance for carers to come together, learn some new skills, gain knowledge around eating disorders to help empower carers to support their loved ones in a more effective way, and thereby supporting them towards change and hopefully recovery. So the webinar you're going to see today is one that we normally hand out and send out to carers as part of the workshop, but we thought it would give you a chance to see some of what we cover. And then Sophie Brazil, who is our Echo Coach coordinator, is going to interview an Echo Coach called Keith Grimwade, and she's going to ask him really some of the questions based around the content that you'll hear from the Raising Resilience webinar. So feel free to grab a pen, make some notes, and please do join us in the Q&A afterwards, where we'll support you to answer your questions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jess Griffiths. I am Clinical Training Lead for BEAT. I'm going to be taking you through this first webinar today on understanding eating disorders. It's part of the programme that makes up Raising Resilience, a new course from BEAT that we're delivering over the next 6 months and hopefully beyond. I guess people often tell us, carers tell us, that they struggle to understand eating disorders. So I'm going to try and do my best today to give you not only kind of clinical knowledge from working with people with eating disorders, but also personal knowledge too. I suffered with an eating disorder for 10 years, from the age of 11 to 21, and I found it super hard to recover. But there was lots of lessons I learned along the way that I'm going to be happy to share with you today. So I would settle in, grab a kind of piece of paper and a pen. If you jot down any questions you've got along the way, please bring them to the first session of Raising Resilience, as the clinicians who are running the courses will leave a bit of space and time in that first session to answer your questions and really give you a chance to reflect on what you've learnt from this time. So I'm going to share my screen. So we've got a bit of a PowerPoint presentation for you. As I say, grab a pen and paper if you haven't got one already. Here we are then. So what are the Raising Resilience sessions based on? Hopefully you've received this book in the post called Skills-Based Caring for a Loved One with an Eating Disorder. And I guess it's such a valuable resource. I'll grab mine. Here it is. You can probably see that it's been very well loved. I've used it an awful lot because I find it so helpful in my own practice as an eating disorders practitioner. I think the great thing about this book is it's evidence-based skills that we know really help people and support them along the journey of recovery. The skills we'll teach you have been researched thoroughly, and we know they work. And so often we hear from carers that I guess, they feel a little bit like they're walking on eggshells. They don't know what to do in certain situations. So, we're really hoping that some of the tools we give you over this time will really raise your confidence, hence the term Raising Resilience. So hopefully if you've received your book, don't worry that it feels like there might be quite a lot in there. We're going to take you through it and there'll be sections for you to read, but hopefully you'll find it really helpful and relatable. So the new Maudsley method is based on evidence-based treatments and what is best for the person with the eating disorder and their carers. Some of these skills do take time to learn and they might feel really alien to you. You might think, why on earth are you asking me to do this? But what we would just say is just bear with it, keep practicing, keep trying, and just be as open as you can to trying these tools and skills that we're going to teach you. I guess, one of the things we love about the courses we teach here at BEAT is that we hopefully really raise hope of recovery. And as you can tell from what I've said in my introduction, I'm fully recovered from an eating disorder. And so part of our job is to instill hope in you that people do completely leave these eating disorders behind in their lives and find other things to live for. So we're hoping that it instills hope in you too, that the same can be the case for your loved one. So what are the kind of things that we generally, I guess, promote as carer skills I reckon self-care strategies are way up there. And I guess sometimes when we're supporting another person in a really difficult place, we want to give our all. And, you know, you've come along to this course, you're obviously really caring and wanting to support your loved one, but we care about you. We see you as our best resource for the person that you're supporting. So we will be talking about how you look after yourself through this time, and how you can maybe get some of those things back in place in your life, maybe that have fallen by the wayside, or it's been hard to prioritise whilst you've been caring for your loved one. So we'll be talking about that through the course. We're going to be looking quite a lot in session 2 of Raising Resilience on the stages of change and transitions. So that's a model we'll teach you about. It's in the book as well. And we'll talk about actually which stage of recovery is your loved one in, and then different ways of communicating with them at those different stages of change. So we have this term that we call high expressed emotion. So that's when I guess it feels like feelings, conversations, things are fraught maybe in the house in terms of everyone feeling pretty stressed out. So we're going to talk about ways that maybe you could reduce some of that and learn skills to manage those in a more confident way, I guess. We're going to talk to you a little bit at the end of session 1 of Raising Resilience about accommodating and enabling behaviours by carers. So those are things that you might be doing completely unknowingly in regards to supporting your loved one that might actually keep some of the eating disorder behaviours, keeping them going, I guess. So you'll have a chance to think through that. We're going to talk about motivational interviewing skills. Now that might seem like a really fancy word and you think, well, I'm not a therapist, how am I going to learn how to do some of these skills? Don't worry, we're going to keep them really basic, and they're just helpful, positive tools, ways of communicating with the person with an eating disorder that will mean that actually conversations go better. We don't end up in these really stressful conversations where we're battling against the eating disorder. And goal setting, I guess we'll be looking at actually, you know, in terms of that session 3, which will be around meal support, actually how can we set goals that will build confidence in you and the person with the eating disorder. It's really hard to know how to set goals sometimes around eating. So hopefully we'll be able to support you in making sure that actually you can keep moving forwards in recovery with your loved one. So as I said, we think that you are our best resource. We want to look after you. We want to give you time over these sessions. And ridiculously, in years gone by, the family was blamed for eating disorders, which is totally unfounded in terms of research. And we actually know there's better outcome if we support you, and there's, you know, less chance of patient relapse if we give you the tools and skills that you need. And we kind of see it as that kind of collaborative care between treatment, you know, services in the NHS, carers, and the loved one. So what kind of, I guess, qualities are we hoping to achieve through the course? So in terms of the C's of collaborative care, I guess we want to try and support you to keep calm in situations. As I said, you're here, you're attending the webinar and the Raising Resilience course, so we know you're caring. We want to teach you how to be curious with this illness, how to ask those questions. You might already know the answer. Have you had your snack today? Well, we're going to think through things like, well, how could you ask in a slightly different way that you might get a more positive response? So curious about, I'm just wondering how your snack went today. So we're teaching you little tweaks to the way you say things that might, you know, reduce that kind of high expressed emotion that we talked about a minute ago. I guess we are instilling the kind of coaching aspects of it with you guys and teaching you how to, I guess, see it, you know, as a marathon rather than a race. You know, it's how can we keep you going in terms of giving you those coaching skills to keep going in that marathon rather than seeing it as a short finish line. You know, for some people it's quite overwhelming to realise that there isn't a quick fix for recovery from an eating disorder. And whilst that might feel overwhelming, like I say, many people do recover fully. And especially when treatment's sought early, you know, the chances of recovery are really good. We are going to talk quite a lot about boundaries through this course. So we're going to teach you about consistency and compassion. You know, as I said, you're here, you're caring, but it's hard to remain compassionate when we're pretty burnt out ourselves. And so we're going to kind of talk about how we can keep your cup full so that you have that energy to bring to caring for this person. So we'll talk about, support networks around you, and how you're supported in your lives so that, as I say, that cup remains full. So we're going to start to talk a little bit about what eating disorders are. And I'm going to try and use a few illustrations really to help you with that. So what are eating disorders? They are, I guess, characterised by an unhealthy relationship with food and a morbid preoccupation with body image, weight and shape. It can affect anyone, regardless of age, gender or background. And obviously it can be really quite dangerous if it's untreated. It's a serious mental illness and it affects, an estimated 1.25 million people in the UK. But if you include families in that, that's 5 million people that are affected by eating disorders. And we've got some of the named eating disorders here. So we've got anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, OSFED, ARFID, and orthorexia. You might not know all of those, but they're in your book, so have a little read. If you haven't heard of some of those, feel free to just take a little look in the reading of the early chapters of the book. And this might just seem like a totally alien response to eating disorders, because I should imagine when you have conversations with the person you're supporting, a lot of the conversation might be around food, weight and shape, and that certainly can happen when I first meet someone that I'm working alongside. But I guess what we're going to try and talk about today is around the fact that actually the feelings underneath an eating disorder are really important. It's the feelings that drive the need for a coping mechanism. And an eating disorder is a coping mechanism for difficult thoughts, emotions, or experiences that might be hidden from others. So issues with food and weight are manifestations of underlying distress. It's not a choice, it's not a diet, it's not attention seeking, it's a way of living and a way of coping with those really uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. So how does that manifest? How does that happen? I'm going to kind of try and get my whiteboard up now, so bear with us. I just kind of switch screens a little bit. Here we go. Hopefully the whiteboard's come up now. So I have my little analogy that I use to try and explain this, and I'm going to try and do it now. So hopefully you can see my two little circles that are appearing. You'll be able to hear me clicking on my laptop as well. Apologies for that. Oh, we had a slight wonky one, but we'll make it work. Okay, should we move it up a bit? Okay, so we've got two circles here, haven't we? So this one is the eating disorder, and this one is the person. Oh, even a persona. Can you see that? What are your initial reflections when you look at that? I suppose I'm thinking as I look at that, okay, so the person's attached to an eating disorder, and it almost looks like if you put the two circles together, a bigger person, not obviously physical in size, but emotionally, it kind of indicates to me that they might feel stronger with that eating disorder. So I guess, what are we doing if we come along in treatment? So, part of the treatment for eating disorder is it might be for someone with anorexia, it might be weight restoration. For someone with bulimia and binge eating disorder, it would be regular eating, and trying to deal with those urges to binge through other ways of coping. But if you take a look and you think, actually, as carers, as we all are, we're trying to get rid of this eating disorder in this person's life. So if we can imagine, let's scrub out that eating disorder. What's left here? So we've got the person left, haven't we? But we've taken their coping mechanism away. And I want you to think about when you're having a bit of a bad day, what do you reach for? I don't know about you, but When I've had a bit of a stressful day, I might go, well, I like taking the dog for a walk. I do like getting some fresh air. If I've had a really busy day and I can't be bothered to cook, I might get a takeaway or something like that. And I think if someone came along to me and said, Jess, you can't have any of those things, I wonder how I might feel. I think I might feel a bit cross, and I might feel quite vulnerable, really. So I suppose, what I want you guys to think about is that actually we're trying to rid this eating disorder, aren't we? We're trying to get rid of it from the person's life and from the family in general. And I think it's important to remember that it has filled that gap in their life, and without it, they might feel really quite vulnerable and scared and a shell of a person. And I guess it's really hard for us to know sometimes, isn't it, where the eating disorder starts and where the person is. So, one of the ways we work in treatment is that we want to try and separate the person out from the eating disorder. Let's see what that looks like, shall we? Let's see if we can. Ooh. So looks that. She says, okay, can you see what I've done there? I've moved them out from the circle. In treatment, what we want to do is not only get carers to recognise which part of the person's the eating disorder, but actually which part is the person. Because we want to build this person up, don't we? We don't want to build the eating disorder up and inflate it. So you might have heard of a phrase, externalising the eating disorder. And that might sound like a really weird phrase, but what we're trying to do is when you guys are interacting with the person who has an eating disorder, we want you to think and label some of the behaviour that they are demonstrating as the eating disorder and label some of it as the person. We'll learn in a minute some of the kind of vulnerabilities around eating disorders, and one of them is low self-esteem. And you might well know that already. But I guess if we're getting cross with a person, which all of us do, I get frustrated with my patients sometimes and I try not to show it. I guess, if we're getting frustrated with the eating disorder, it might dent that self-esteem that we really want to nurture and build up. So it might be that you say something like, I know this isn't you behaving like this, is the illness, this is the eating disorder that's talking to me here. And then when you can see that they make a choice on behalf of themselves, you can say, actually, that's really you. I can see that's really you interacting with me. Hopefully that makes sense. And in your session, if you want more explanation on that, the clinician will be able to talk you through that even more. But hopefully it gives you some sort of idea around why people develop eating disorders. The other thing is that, emotionally, in terms of how an eating disorder works, we hear that it does work. I guess people wouldn't continue to do them otherwise. When it comes to anorexia nervosa and kind of restrictive eating, we know that it kind of numbs emotions. People don't feel as much when they are almost giving into their eating disorder or following the rules it says, and it numbs those really distressing feelings. And with bulimia and binge eating disorder, the same really, that, binging on food, quite often they talk about this kind of release that they feel whilst they're binging on food, and that makes whatever feeling there was in the first place reduce down or minimises it a bit. But obviously we know that the guilt and shame of some of these behaviours then creep in too, and actually they haven't dealt with maybe whatever underlying emotion it was in the first place, so the feeling just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And therefore the coping mechanism becomes more addictive, because the bigger the feeling is, the more they might need their eating disorder to manage that feeling. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so we'll go back to our presentation now. So we're just going to have a little look at the underlying causes of eating disorders. Possibly, I suppose, better way of putting it is really who's susceptible to developing eating disorders. What do we know around who develops them? So we know that perinatal adversity is a really important one. So actually, the person who developed the eating disorder, what was it like for them during the pregnancy? Was there stress around for the mother? Was there adequate nutrition? So we know there's a link between prematurity and low birth weight and eating disorders and other infant health issues and factors. We know that, I guess, family and peer factors can come into it. So, you know, where food and weight, where it's a high expectation in culture, which we know it is, it's everywhere, isn't it? That actually to be popular, you need to be thin or you need to look a certain way. We know that teasing or criticism or shapeism is important. And we know that actually 2/3 of people who develop eating disorders have been bullied in the past. And then we've got kind of life events as well. So any loss, any trauma, any transition is really important. Genetics wise, there isn't really like a specific gene for eating disorders, but they have identified a genome, so a cluster of genes that seem to, I suppose, be a contributory factor to someone developing an eating disorder. They've done studies on twins, and I think the statistic is that where one of a set of identical twins had an eating disorder, the other identical twin was 10 times more likely to have an eating disorder than non-identical twins. So there is a genetic element there. And then what are these other kind of characteristics that might contribute to risk of developing an eating disorder? Someone who's kind of naturally sensitive to stress and other negative emotions, I kind of call them super feelers. So people who are really intuitive, super caring people, they really feel things very deeply. I guess, you know, they could be very susceptible to an eating disorder. People who are quite rigid in their thinking, have difficulty in being flexible or dealing with changes. People with what we call a weak central coherence, so they might focus on the detail without seeing the bigger picture. And I suppose, you know, coping strategies they might develop are avoidance, impulsivity, compulsivity, and addictions. In that kind of super feeler nature, I guess a lot of their interactions and interactions with the world can feel quite overwhelming. And I suppose that means that for people with eating disorders, life can feel quite overwhelming. We know that people with eating disorders don't read emotion correctly in other people and be able to identify it within themselves. So an example of this could be that as a young child, my mum would say to me that she literally would raise an eyebrow at me, and I would be on the floor crying in a ball because I thought she was telling me off, even though actually it was just a facial expression and she wasn't actually telling me off at all. So I was hypersensitive to reading emotion, I guess, in other people. And we know people with eating disorders can be people pleasers, can be real high achievers academically. But I guess if someone's a people pleaser, they tend to respond a lot to external factors, don't they? So to external influences and do what people want. But I guess, you know, if you're consistently doing what other people want, you lose your sense of self because you're not listening to your inner voice and following what you want to do. And that can be a way that you kind of lose control of your life in a sense, because it becomes about other people and not about you taking care of yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, we definitely see traits of low self-esteem and perfectionism. And sometimes this is why eating disorders go undetected, really, because they're really good people, they're really conscientious people, they're probably really well-behaved children. And so it's really hard to spot some of these signs, isn't it? But I guess the other thing that's important to recognise, and I read this recently, was that 2/3 of the factors that contribute towards an eating disorder are actually personality and genetics and character traits. So, you know, whilst obviously the environment is important, most of the factors that cause an eating disorder are actually to do with personality type. And I also think that brings comfort to carers too, because, you know, I've met many families who feel really guilty or worried that their loved ones developed an eating disorder and might take the blame on themselves. And like I say, there's not really any evidence to suggest that. And as a parent myself, there's always room for improvement. I'm consistently learning how difficult it is to parent, well, I've got one teenager and two younger ones. We're not expecting anyone to be perfect here. We can always learn more. But what I would say is that you didn't cause this eating disorder. You haven't caused it, but you are the answer to some of the journey through recovery. So I guess we're going to think about, actually, in this whole situation then, in whatever situation your loved one is in at the minute, what is it we can and can't control as carers? So let's have a little look at this. So we've got the eating disorder behaviours, haven't we? We've got the unwillingness maybe to accept that they are ill. We've got the stress, the anxiety, and the depression surrounding the illness. We can't really control some of those things in our loved one, can we? I guess what we can control are our beliefs about the illness. So as we've done today, trying to learn and understand it a little bit better. We could look at, ways that we might be doing things unknowingly that might keep the eating disorder going. We could look at our own interpersonal relationships. We could look at our own role strain, our own respite care, contact time, and we can look at our other kind of unmet needs. So hopefully throughout these sessions, you'll learn, what you can do to really make changes in this whole situation, and we can support you to reflect on these things and see how you can make changes in your own lives around it. And the good thing is there are tools, there is hope, there are things that we can learn to make this situation better for everyone. So there we go. What we're going to do, we're going to get information from the workshops, we're going to learn the skills to avoid, we're going to stand back from compulsively caring and controlling. I think one of the aspects of supporting someone with an eating disorder is that you want to fix it. I mean, as a parent, when my child falls over and hurts their knee, what do? I go and give them a big hug and I make it all better. I put a plaster on. But actually, with eating disorders, it doesn't always seem that that's the case. I guess when someone's hurting, we want to make it better. But I guess, you just heard me explain that people with eating disorders feel very deeply. And the only way through, I guess, is feeling, allowing those feelings to rise up and rise down. And that's quite hard for us, I think, as parents and as carers, is that we almost have to watch them ride that out. At the moment, they've got this coping mechanism that interrupts that riding out of the feelings. So not only do we obviously have to wait it out ourselves, we have to wait it out with them and encourage them to, I guess, push through that distress. And that's a really tall order. But it also means that if we go in and fix it and take control, they might not learn themselves, they might not learn that resilience, because actually they might do something different or do something that they know works better for them in terms of managing those emotions. So some of what we'll learn over this time is how we stand back from that kind of compulsive caring and control. And hopefully we'll kind of teach you how to delegate and be good enough. I think the thing is that we're never going to get it all right. We're never going to get things perfect ourselves. And we don't want to mirror the illness in that sense. Sometimes I can feel really anxious when I am in a session with someone. And I feel like sometimes there's a lot of pressure to come up with some answers and to make it okay. And I almost feel like I'm backed into a corner and, pushed into that. I need to come up with the answers. And I think, sometimes it's okay to say you don't know, or it's okay to say I need a bit of time to respond to this and to slow everything down, because everyone just ends up feeling in this anxious space, don't they? And that might not be helpful for the situation as a whole. So generally our suggestion is that where you feel there are mistakes is that just see them as learning. We don't actually learn from everything that goes right. We learn from the whoopsies in life, don't we? So I think it's really important to come with an approach of learning in regards to your caring role, and that you're good enough. You're only human, and only, all of us have only got a certain amount of energy, and sometimes, we can only do our best. So that's really important to hear today. And then thinking about how you might get breaks, it's really hard to, to think that anyone could possibly care for our loved ones as well as we can, and the chances are they probably can't. But I guess, you know, we're always trying to address the balance between self-care and the person being looked after, and sometimes it will be a question of, actually, is my self-care more important in this moment, or do I really need to prioritize myself and let someone else do the caring for me? And I know that might come as a bit of a challenge, but it's something we can explore further in the sessions. And then we're going to look at increasing your support network as well, and just thinking through who those people might be, who you can go to for support at the moment. And as I've said, caring for yourself is important. There was a little extra box there I didn't know was coming up. It's that kind of classic case of putting your own oxygen mask on first before you put others on. Filling your tank up so that you're able to support in the calmest way possible when you're not feeling burnt out. So what happens then when we have these eating disorder behaviours occurring? So we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition now. And you might just be able to see that brain slide in the middle there. This is actually a slide of someone with anorexia nervosa, and you might notice that, you know, a big portion of the brain is actually missing in the middle there. And actually, you know, the brain structure changes in starvation. So we're going to talk a little bit through that now. So we've talked about this kind of coping mechanism of the way they cope with the stress is by avoidance. So they either ignore the pain or the hunger, or they overeat to numb the pain as well. And what does that lead to? I guess the belief that control of eating will reduce stress, but it actually leads to a decreased nutrition. But actually what we do know is decreased nutrition leads to more anxiety and intense negative emotions, alongside the kind of numbing of negative and positive emotions. And what happens then? Consequences are the brain structure actually changes over time and becomes more ingrained, and it's reduced self-regulatory function. And later consequences are actually they don't cope as well, and the brain functions impaired by poor nutrition. They actually become more sensitive to threats and more rigid, ruled by habits and routines, and that cycle can just go round and round. So once again, this self-regulation system, so it actually decreases abilities in thinking about social situations, regulating emotion, decision making, flexibility, planning, and it increases compulsive behaviours, avoidance of emotion, difficult situations, reaction to threat, and sensitivity to punishment. So the areas responsible for rational thought and self-regulation is the most sensitive to starvation and stress. And I think quite often, you know, carers find it really helpful to realise that actually the brain structure changes. So that rational part of the brain is not working. It doesn't have enough energy to kick in. And not a lot is rational about an eating disorder, is it? And we can kind of get so, I guess, frustrated and thinking, well, why can't they see it? Why can't they see it? Well, part of it is that brain structure has changed, and it needs energy to find new ways of thinking and problem solving and dealing with situations. So hopefully that kind of helps. You know, you can talk more about this starvation syndrome in your sessions if you need to. So we do know actually that there are some other traits with ED. So an ED is eating disorder individual, just in case you didn't know. And there are some shared traits between people who have the eating disorder and carers. There might be similarities in this all or nothing thinking, or perfectionism, or rigidity of thinking. Because like I say, you know, some of it's genetic, and it's not that everyone who has these ways of thinking gets an eating disorder, but we might be able to recognise some of our own traits and some of what we've been learning about today. But, you know, people with eating disorders, you know, really have that stuff it. They don't have the stuff it gene. They really care about everything. They find it very hard to let go. So it produces this all or nothing thinking, focused way of looking at everything. And you probably can feel that in some conversations that you have with them. Detail around meal plans, detail without seeing the bigger picture of nutrition as a whole. The details in the moment, isn't it? This is going to make me fat. that's where you see the eating disorder and the detail coming out. But the other qualities we know is that people with eating disorders obviously are really focused, they're really determined, and all these are really great qualities. You know, when I channeled all these qualities into recovery, it happens quite quickly, really, when it was, I guess, I was moving towards a positive place rather than a destructive one. And we know that people with eating disorders are reliable, loyal, determined, and good planners. So they're generally great people to have around. And I suppose, you know, underlying it all, I guess, the way I perceive it is that it's generally around self-compassion. I guess recovery is about acceptance of self and how you can rewire the brain to think differently and have a positive approach to yourself. That was certainly the case for me. I spent a lot of time journaling and weeding out a lot of negative thoughts that I had let fester, I guess, and let take root in my brain. And part of my recovery was, you know, learning and acknowledging that I needed to look after myself. I needed to like myself, maybe like's too strong a word, accept myself and grow to like myself, and not, you know, continuing with the negative way of thinking about myself. Yeah, recovery involves quite a few penny drop moments, but that was certainly one for me. It was around self-compassion. So it has felt a bit doom and gloom around what we've said so far, but hopefully we've instilled some hope, and, you know, some of the examples I've given of my journey have, you know, made you realise that, you know, eating disorders don't last forever. The great news is the brain's amazing and totally plastic. So, like I just mentioned to you, I literally retrained my brain to think a different way, through kind of systematic journaling, through correcting thinking errors, and genuinely, very rarely allow myself to have a negative thought about myself now. And I think it's kind of that neuroplasticity. So I think, you know, I always liken it to, you know, if someone's had a stroke, and they go to see the physio, don't they? And they have rehab to try and wake up other neural pathways and to the muscles to help them adapt to maybe some of where they might be paralysed. Well, I think, you know, this is similar with eating disorders. It's finding new neural pathways. It's developing new ways of thinking. And the damaged brain can often reorganise itself so that one part fails, another can often substitute. But if brain cells die, they can at times be replaced. That many circuits and even basic reflexes that we think are hardwired are not. So there is hope. Well, I hope you've enjoyed, I said hope many times there. I really hope you've enjoyed spending time with me today. Well done for making it through to the end of this session. Feel free to listen to it again if you can bear it. There's a lot of information that we've covered today, and so it might be a lot to take in. So hopefully you've been jotting down questions as you've gone along, and that you're going to bring them to your first session of Raising Resilience. And really hopeful that you enjoy those sessions and that you get a lot out of it. And you'll see me again soon. Take care. Bye.
Hi Keith, thank you so much for joining us today. So today we have Keith, who's experienced caring for his loved one who struggled with anorexia. So Keith joined us as an echo coach in April 2020, and since then he has kindly supported 3 carers. Along with that, Keith is the co-chair at the East of England's Eating Disorder Network, which is run by NHS England. And on top of that, he also runs a weekly online support group with his local trust. So yeah, Keith, it's lovely to have you here today. I'm obviously the Echo coordinator at Beat. We decided to have a get together to talk about Raising Resilience, one of the webinars, and some of the content that's covered in that. So we're going to do a little bit of a question and answer today. And my first question to Keith is going to be, so as a carer for a loved one with an eating disorder, did you find that externalizing the eating disorder helped your loved one in their recovery? So when I say externalizing the eating disorder, we talk a lot about how you should try and separate that person's eating disorder voice from their own voice, and how it can help kind of distinguish between that. So you might say things to your loved ones such as, "This is the eating disorder talking to me right now," or "I can really hear that's you." So yes, the question was, did you find it helped your loved one in their recovery?
Thanks, Sophie, and it's good to be here. The short answer to your question is yes, incredibly helpful. It's such a hard illness to understand. The signs and symptoms are not necessarily obvious, especially in the early stages. And it really took me a long time to get my head around the idea that there was an illness that your loved one might not want, at least in the first instance, to get better from, because it was providing something for them, helping them to manage feelings, emotions that were just too strong for them to cope with otherwise. Yeah. And so as a carer, it can be very incredibly hard, because what you have is a set of behaviors that can be really challenging, really confusing, very, very hard to understand. And to know that it's the illness talking and not your loved one is really helpful. It makes it easier to stay calm and compassionate, because you know it's not your real loved one. And of course, unlike a physical illness, you can't see it, so it's harder to separate the illness from the person. So you know, it helps you be compassionate. It's less personal, because you can think who you're having the conversation with. Yeah, it helps you get the responses. You can say things like, "That's the eating disorder talking," yeah. Rather than actually making what is a personal criticism. You can challenge the illness rather than the person, the behavior rather than the person. I've worked with carers who find it really helpful to give that eating disorder personality a name. We didn't do that, but it was still helpful to be able to make the separation. But by giving it a name, it allows you all to have a conversation with the illness, and I think it can help our loved ones make that separation as well. So although I'll be perfectly honest, I found it really hard to understand and to get my head round in the early stages. It was really helpful once the penny dropped.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Keith. Yes, a lot of the echo coaches said that they found it very helpful too. One of the echo coaches said that they named the eating disorder Ursula, which sometimes brought a bit of humour as well into the situation. Yes. Brilliant. Yes. Yes. So just moving on from that question. So obviously in the webinar, Jess talks about how, you know, sometimes people with an eating disorder can show characteristics of perfectionism and rigidity in their loved one, which can make it very challenging in recovery. Did you see these personality traits of perfectionism and rigidity in your loved one? And if so, how did you manage these characteristics in recovery?
Yes, well, very much so, Sophie, especially as our loved one was diagnosed with OCD prior to being diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, and of course rigidity and repeated patterns of behaviour, repeated asking of questions is very much part of that illness as well. And it's certainly something that continued when our loved one was diagnosed with anorexia, and talking to other carers is very, very common. So how how did I manage these characteristics? I've got to be honest, Sophie, in the first instance, I don't think I managed them very well. I really don't.
Not a dolphin to begin with, Keith.
I tried to be logical. I tried to have sort of not aggressive arguments, but tried to put up counter arguments. I don't feel actually that we were helped tremendously by the CAM service at the time, that asked us to enforce rules, including restraint, which was very hard to do. And I really don't think it was the right approach. And we tried everything that we were asked to do to the best of our ability. And when it didn't work, it did feel as if it was our fault that we'd done it wrong, rather than the advice was wrong. We had issues with both rigidity and perfectionism, and with regards to perfectionism, people with an eating disorder almost invariably are incredibly high achievers. That in a way there are some perverse plus sides to this illness. But I think there, or in terms of how we tried to deal with that, I don't think we did add extra pressure or stress with regards to schoolwork. But again, I don't think my approach was very helpful or useful. But most parents offer 10p or whatever for every spelling that their child gets right. I offered 10p for every spelling our loved one got wrong, to try to make them feel less anxious about it. But I think that was wrong, because I think I was not taking something that was very seriously enough. And so I'm prepared to hold my hands up to, I do not think initially I managed those traits very well. I think what made the difference was getting support and family support through the eating disorders service, and we learned a better way for us as parents and carers to support those traits, to listen, to be curious, to ask how I might help, rather than come up with stupid ideas, and to be consistent when repeatedly asked questions. You've asked me that before. When we talked about this last time, we agreed that you would not ask that again. And to ride out our anxiety while they are riding out their anxiety. So I'm afraid I was a slow learner, but with support, I think we found a better way. And what I would say to other carers is, of course you're going to do those things that don't work, because that's what any parent would do. They would do anything to try to help their loved one. But actually you have to do some things that are quite counterintuitive for this illness that is such a difficult, hard illness to understand.
Definitely, yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Keith, and I think it's a massive learning process for carers of a loved one with an eating disorder, and you're not necessarily going to get it right at the start. It's such a challenging time. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear your insight on that. So we're just going to talk a little bit about self-care. So at Beat, we think it's really important that carers look after themselves to be the best support for their loved one. And one of the key messages that we communicate in Echo Coaching is self-care for carers is crucial. We also use the oxygen mask analogy quite a lot when trying to communicate this to carers, which can be quite challenging because a lot of carers just want to look after their loved one and can find it difficult to understand the importance of self-care to be the best support for their loved one. So my question to you is, when you started engaging in self-care, how did you find it impacted your loved one and their recovery?
Yes. I mean, looking after yourself is really important. It is easier said than done. And I remember being given strong encouragement to plan some time for myself, for ourselves, for our relationship. And you don't realise at the time how caught up in it you all are and what impact that is having on the care that you're giving. It is a sad reality that this illness can be a very long illness, but it's also the case that the vast majority of people with an eating disorder recover. Although as I said, it takes much longer than you would think. So it really is important to look after yourself, and it's good role modelling. And I think that role modelling has an impact, although it isn't something that I could particularly quantify or give specific examples about. But I do think it makes a difference. I think that the biggest impact of self-care on our loved one's recovery was through our eating disorders support group that the local trust ran. I did not think that I was a support group sort of person. I never really imagined myself going to a support group. I was I can sort this out for myself sort of person. And initially, I was not keen to go. And I was very gently encouraged. I realise now that I was getting the full force, some very sophisticated dolphin skills applied to me by the eating disorders team. I was very gently encouraged to attend our support group, and for me it was a revelation. Support groups don't work for everyone. Some people can find them just too emotionally charged and too upsetting. But for me, it really helped to be in a room with people who had some understanding of where I was coming from, where I didn't have to explain everything to them from scratch, and where I was getting some professional input, advice and guidance on caring, and also hearing from lived experience what had worked and what hadn't. And for me, being involved with the support group was the biggest component of self-care. And what I learned through that really was those really important caring skills, stepping back rather than instead of stepping in, staying calm rather than rushing into action, helping our loved one to reflect, to name feelings rather than dictating and saying what they were. And I really think that bit of self-care helped me to give the space to create the environment that made recovery more impossible. So whatever bit of looking after yourself, whatever bit of self-care works for you, you've got to find it and you've got to do it, because you've got to stay fit and well. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to give the best possible care.
Definitely, yeah, and that's a really good point. Keith, you know, it's a marathon, not a race, and so you need to be able to look after yourself in that duration of time. And as you said, you've got to find what works for you, and it's really positive to hear that you did find the support group so useful, and that it did give you that help that you needed. I suppose just to add on from that question, you know, you're supporting your third carer at the moment now. Have you found it kind of easy? Have they found it easy to understand the importance of self-care, or has that been quite a big learning process?
I think intellectually it's very easy to understand. I think it's just terribly difficult to put into practice.
Yeah.
Because as a parent, as a carer, you want to do everything possible. And it is a bit counterintuitive to accept, believe, understand that actually stepping back and not doing quite so much might be the most helpful thing to do.
Yeah.
That's really hard to understand. And it can be really hard to find time to recharge your batteries. But just like you don't want your car to run out of petrol because it's going to stop, you do have to do it at some point. What I discuss with carers that I've worked with is I really get how hard this is. So let's just take it in small steps. Let's not have a grand weekend away straight away, and let's just start with something small. Actually, I remember we were required to write something down and to hand it in and to say that we'd done it. As part of family therapy. And our first step was a relatively short walk to a really lovely local meadow, just for a break, just to get some fresh air and to have a few moments away ourselves. I still go there regularly, and I think of that every time I go. It was the first step.
Brilliant. And so important that you took that step, even though it might have felt really small at the time. Fab. Thank you so much for answering those questions on self-care. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the cycle of change. And the question that I'd like to ask you about the cycle of change, I know that you've covered this in some of the support groups you've done with the carers, is what was the impact of understanding the cycle of change as a carer? So could you kind of explain a little bit more about the cycle of change?
Powerful and profound. I found learning about the cycle of change one of those light bulb moments. It was by far and away one of the most useful things to know and understand. It gave us hope, or it gives hope, that the vast majority of people, even when they're stuck and not even thinking about making any changes, the vast majority of people do eventually make small steps in the right direction and move through that cycle of change. And it was really helpful understanding that it wasn't linear and straightforward as well, because I mean, we use a whole range. We really mix our metaphors, both in the peer coaching and in the support group discussions. We have snakes and ladders. We have roller coasters. But it is like that, and understanding that actually you can always roll back to a previous stage and then move forward again, and that is actually part of recovery. Was really reassuring and helpful as well. But the biggest thing about it is that, you know, there is something that you can do at whatever stage your loved one is at. But this has to be different. You can tailor your support and your help so that it is going to be most helpful. It allows us to answer where is our loved one at, and how can I tailor my support, and then to have the confidence to roll down a stage if necessary and build back up again, because you know that that's part of the process, that it's not the end, it's just another step.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I think it is such an important process, and I love your analogy, the snakes and ladders as well, because like you say, you are, at times you might fall back and times you might take a step forwards. So another question is just to follow on from that, what helped at the different stages of change, or what do you wish you'd known at each stage of change?
Yes. And when I knew we were going to be having this conversation, I checked back at some of my notes, because I do find it helpful to jot things down and to refer to them. And I've done that repeatedly with the cycle of change, actually. Our loved one has made a recovery, has now been discharged. That process took 9 years, and there were ups and downs, and I've found it very helpful to go back and check my notes to see what helped before, because you learn something every time. You've got something to go back to, and I was surprised really at how much I'd jotted down. And for each of the stages of the cycle of change, I've got different things written down. I'm quite happy to run through some of those if you think that might be of interest. Yes,
that would be brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, I think the pre-contemplation stage, when our loved one is not even thinking of changing their behaviour, is a really, really difficult one. And I mean, and it can be a very long stage, as you know from Beat's work. What is it, about a year and a half? Yeah, it's a long time, isn't it? Yes. Before someone recognises on average that they have an eating disorder. So you can see your loved one getting more poorly. You know there's something wrong, and they'll not accept it. I mean, that is really, really difficult. And just knowing that you can work towards creating an awareness of the problem is really helpful. So, I mean, some of the things I've jotted down are the first one is hang in there. Because, it's impossible to imagine at the time, but that stage does pass. All things must pass.
All things must pass.
And that's when you really do need to look after yourself, and hopefully you've got some folk who can support you as well. If that is where your loved one is at, you will learn by bitter experience that you can't argue with an eating disorder. So don't push too hard, because it will be counterproductive. You will just back your loved one into a corner. They will come up with more arguments for why they are right and you're wrong. And definitely don't give advice when it's not wanted, because it will just simply be ignored. You will be wasting your breath. And again, I think I learned the hard way. I mean, what you can do is you can really show empathy. You can say, oh, that must have been so important for you. I can see why you didn't want to miss it. The more you can try to show that you see it's really hard for them, the better, because they're going to feel that you're on their side and that they're not making it up. You can give factual feedback about their health, not judgments, not evaluations, not you're looking thin. But factual judgments about being tired, or being unwell, that again will show that you've noticed. Because if your loved one thinks, if you don't say anything about it, your loved one might think, well, actually, well, maybe there isn't anything wrong. This is all right. They've not said anything. So so I think giving that sort of feedback can help. And then the one that I think is really, really important is keeping the communication bridge open, and having conversations that aren't to do with the eating disorder, being able to talk with your loved one about the bit that isn't the illness. Going back to that first question. Now, that is an awful lot that you can do.
Definitely.
But you might feel, I'm not getting anywhere. We should be having some plans. We should be doing something about this. Relatives might be saying, oh, well, why don't you just make them eat? That's not the approach. So understanding that even in that stage, showing empathy, giving factual feedback, keeping the communication bridge open, and not pushing too hard, not stepping in and trying to take over, is what is going to make it easier for your loved one to move to the next stage. That's certainly been my experience. And then when they do make those steps, it's and when they're thinking about change, the one that I found really helpful was discussing pros and cons. Just setting up a little bit of a gentle challenge. On the one hand, you want to go back to university, and on the other, you don't have the energy to concentrate properly. And then the really difficult bit for me was leaving it at that. The natural inclination was to push it towards a conclusion, to get an agreement. Oh yeah, well, in that case, I'll do this. And it's setting up those pros and cons, and then just leaving them hang, because it is our loved ones who've got to. Only they can take this decision. Only they can change their behaviour. We can't change it for them. We can help them, but we can't actually do it. So avoid the temptation of saying what they should do. My experience is that was definitely counterproductive. And be curious. What are they hanging on to? And think about the pros and cons of that as well. So that was really helpful in the contemplation stage. And then it required an awful lot of discipline for somebody like me, who had to learn to be a dolphin, because they're a bit of a natural rhino, and wants to come up with a plan. Right, got a problem, we'll have a plan, we'll put it into action, we'll get it done, we'll check, we'll go back and do things if necessary. But at the preparation stage, that is really where you have to make sure that you are staying alongside rather than stepping in and taking the lead again. And I struggled with that. I can categorically say that my experience is it's much better to stay alongside, to nudge, to encourage, to step back, to step in again if they're struggling, and to ask if they want help, and if they do, to get involved. But if they don't, just to accept it and ride with it. And then you get to the action stage. I jotted some things down about that as well. There's more here than I thought there was. Goodness, yes, yeah. What I found really helpful when our loved one was really taking significant steps in the right direction was remembering to ask, how can I help, rather than making the assumption of knowing how I could help.
Yeah.
So again, it's the not stepping in again, and it's providing plenty of validation, not just praise, but validation. So, you know, I can see how hard you are trying. It's going so well, and sort of validate the positive characteristics that you want to encourage, the bravery, the confidence, the hard work, and to be very observant, because what might seem an incredibly small step to us and hardly worth comment might be an incredibly big step to our loved one. So it really is important to listen carefully, to hear what they're saying, and to listen carefully. You have to give them space to say things. Some of these things are really hard to talk about. So again, it's a case of, you might not think you're doing very much by sitting there and just listening and not saying and doing anything, but it might very well be the most helpful thing that you can possibly do. And then the maintenance stage, it's every carer, every parent whose loved one has reached that stage will know what I mean when I talk about that sinking feeling, when your loved one says something and you think, oh no, we're going back again, or they miss 2 or 3 meals in a row, and you've really got to not worry, first of all, about minor blips. And then, of course, to remember that normal people can be like that as well, and that there are some times when we don't actually fancy our dinner for whatever reason, and it, you know, it's you have to remember to stay calm, and again to make the connections between what they're doing now and what they wanted to do. So to go back to my university example, the pros and cons, you want to go back to university, but you don't have the energy. If they've made it back to university, it's great that you've been able to get back to university. You wouldn't have been able to do that 6 months ago. So you make the connection between the change that they've made. And it really does help to plan out some of these things for when it might be useful to feed them into conversation. And Janet Treasure's book is extremely helpful. You do run the risk of the experience I had on one occasion when I was told, that's not what you're supposed to say next. What it says on page 164 is, but I can ride with that. And relapse. In fact, we discussed this at the support group that I'm involved with, and we would prefer to call it a lapse rather than a relapse, because it is another step towards recovery. It does happen. Why I say it's a step towards recovery, because you've got that far, there is so much that your loved one has learnt, that you have learnt, that you'll be able to go back to, especially if you've scribbled some things down like I have, and you can remind yourself what worked last time. You're not starting from scratch. You can build up again. And it is really a case of using the animal metaphors to be a St. Bernard. Don't panic, stay calm, and stay caring. And part of being consistent is going back and seeing what worked before and then building up from that. So I think, as you probably detect, for me, the cycle of change really was a light bulb moment, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and found really, really helpful, working with our loved one and helping them towards their recovery.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Keith. And thank you for such a detailed response as well. I think it's really helpful to break down each stage and what you can do as a carer, and hopefully, you know, people listening to this will find that really helpful as well. So yes, that's all the questions for this afternoon. Thank you so much for kindly talking through this with me and bringing your pearls of wisdom. It's been great to have you on board, and we're very thankful for all that you do to support us at Beat.
Well, I'd like to return the favour, Sophie. We as carers, and I know our loved ones, are extremely grateful for the support that Beat provides, and I'm only too happy to help.
Thank you, Keith. That means so much. Thank you.